Hello, everybody. I'm just going to give it a few minutes for starting. All right. Thank you all for joining. We're going to go ahead and get started. On behalf of the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health at the University of Maryland School of Public Health, I welcome you all to the ninth symposium on environmental justice and health disparities. My name is Alexandra Peak. I am the Climate and Environmental Justice Strategist at Carbon Direct. Carbon Direct is a carbon management company that leads with a science-first, climate-first approach made up of an interdisciplinary team to answer the demand for high quality and durable carbon removal. I would like to thank all of the organizers at the Center for Community Engagement and Environmental Justice and Health for all of their hard work and dedication to putting together another year of important conversations and powerful collaborations, as well as immense gratitude to the event sponsors, without whom the UMD EJ Symposium would not be possible. In addition, I'd like to give a special thanks to Dr. Christian Branian, the head of Climate Justice Department at Carbon Direct. Thanks to Dr. Branian, we are gathered here today for this panel as he was a visionary and architect of this session. Now for the main event. This panel session is on climate and environmental justice implications of carbon dioxide removal, CDR, and carbon capture storage, CCS. CDR removes emissions from the atmosphere, while CCS captures carbon from industrial processes before it enters the atmosphere. Carbon removal supports a drawdown in emissions, while carbon capture and sequestration can help to neutralize emissions associated with burning fossil fuels. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, the scientific body assembled by the United Nations, who is responsible for advancing scientific knowledge about climate change caused by human activities, has issued a red alert in their latest report released this year. Climate change is already here, causing extreme weather and climate disasters and leading to altered marine, terrestrial, and freshwater ecosystems around the world. The mass mortality of plants, critters, animals, and small organisms, as well as measurable impacts on the economy and livelihood losses, causing alteration of cultural practices, displacement, and loss of human life. The urgency now is to reduce and remove greenhouse gases and stay below global temperatures of 1.5 degrees Celsius. The climate crisis, while human-induced, was not caused by all humans equally, and the worst of the impacts are affecting the least responsible. These including people living in the global south, such as Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and low income and Black, Indigenous, and people of color living within rich countries. Several mitigation strategies have been laid out by the scientists in the IPCC report. Among them, carbon capture pathways and technologies, to reduce and remove CO2 from the atmosphere, which is necessary to avert reaching global temperatures of above 1.5 degrees Celsius. Today, we are here to discuss the implications of mass deployment of CDR and CCS technologies in the context of environmental and climate justice, a movement from around the world that recognizes the disproportionate impact of climate change on vulnerable populations, made vulnerable because of histories of colonization, neocolonialism, racial inequities, and marginalization. I am pleased to present your moderator for this panel, Dr. Astrid Caldas. Dr. Caldas is a senior climate scientist for community resilience at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Her work focuses on community resilience, science communication, environmental justice, and equitable climate-related policies with practical implications for nature and society. Welcome, Astrid.
Thank you very much, Beek. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I am going to be moderating this session. We have 4 wonderful panelists. The way that this is going to play out is each panelist is going to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. And then we're going to open up for your questions. So please put your questions in the comments and we'll keep track of them. And we're looking forward to having a great discussion. I'm going to now introduce the panelists in the order that they will speak. I'm just going to give their names and their the titles and organizations. Their bios will be available, full bios will be available in the program. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to do a quick introduction. So first to speak will be Maya Batres, Senior Advisor for Climate Equity at the Nature Conservancy. She will be followed by Dr. Ana Batista, Associate Professor of Professional Practice in the Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management Graduate Program at the Milano School of Policy, Management and Environment. That's a mouthful. And she is also co-director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School. Following that, we will hear from Lenore Curol, who is the Director and Administrator at the United Homa Nation. And finally, we'll hear from Nicole Parra, Vice President for Community Affairs at the California Resources Corporation, and also a previous member of the California State Assembly. So we have a good representation of all important stakeholders in this issue of CCS and CDR. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to Maya. Maya, take it away.
Thank you, Astrid. And thank you to the organizers for having me. Again, my name is Maya Batres. I'm the Senior Advisor for Climate Equity at the Nature Conservancy. My role at TNC is focused on integrating principles of justice and equity into our climate strategies in North America. And that includes thinking about how we deploy infrastructure projects, how, where, what kind, and how we will achieve our decarbonization goals in a way that's good for people and nature. My main role on this panel today is to lay the groundwork for a discussion on environmental justice and equity considerations related to carbon management approaches, which is no short order, but luckily it's not just up to me. I'm joined by a host of great panelists who are going to go more in depth than I will just in my brief remarks to start. And I'm excited for this conversation. I feel like I'm kind of going into this blind. I wish I could see all of your faces, see who's in the room, and have the opportunity to network with you later. But I just want to say thanks for joining us because I think it's such an important topic. So I'm going to try and do 2 things. The first is to really lay out the suite of technologies and approaches that we're talking about. And the second is to map out some of the environmental justice and climate justice considerations that may apply. And again, I'm really looking to my co-panelists in this session to go more in depth on these issues, but just want to lay the foundation here a little bit. So the first is that carbon management is a pretty broad term, and it includes a lot of different things, but at the very least includes carbon capture and carbon removal approaches. And while these are often lumped together, including in this session, They're approaches that are really different. So I'm just going to borrow from growing season that's happening here in Sacramento, California, where I am, and say, if we had a panel on tomatoes, we would be talking about a lot of different things, not just Roma tomatoes or heirloom tomatoes, but right, like the whole suite of different types of vegetables that we might be interested in. And I just set up that analogy because I think it's important to recognize that we're talking about a lot here. Carbon capture refers to point source capture of carbon dioxide from a stationary source. So that could be a power plant, like a natural gas facility, or an industrial facility, like a cement plant, just as two examples. Carbon removal means capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere using either technology, like direct air capture, or using nature, like afforestation, reforestation in soils or in water systems. Sometimes carbon capture and carbon removal are used synonymously and lumped together, as I said. But for the purposes of environmental justice and equity considerations, it's really important that we be as specific as possible, not just about the technologies, but about the specifics of a given project to fully understand the implications of what we mean here. So that brings me to the second part of what I hope to do today, which is set up some of the environmental justice and climate justice considerations of carbon management approaches. And because we're going to hear more about from other panelists on what that means, here's what I would say. When we're thinking about equity and justice, we have to remember that it's not just a what, it's not just an outcome, it's a way of doing things. And so how we build these things matters. That means it matters how we source materials for projects, how we power them, how we decide where projects are located, what kind of air quality implications they may have, what kind of environmental, including land use and biodiversity considerations they may have, how we treat workers who are part of building these projects, what communities are involved, how communities are consulted, if communities are consulted, and that list goes on. So there's a lot of considerations, not just for each type of technology, but each project itself. It's really difficult to encapsulate what environmental justice or climate justice will look like for a specific technology or project. Second, I would say how we regulate and make decisions around these projects really matters. How much should we rely on these technologies? What are acceptable uses of CO2 captured from point sources or from the atmosphere? Should we allow for carbon removal to be used for offsetting emissions? Who should be able to build these projects and to what end? How should we scale these technologies? Who gets to answer these questions and how? And I think those are all just the starting points of questions. How we answer and address these issues is going to have really significant implications locally, but also globally. And I think that we're really only scratching the surface right now in real time of addressing these issues in communities, in policy, in regulatory spheres, including in this conversation. We're starting to see these issues pop up in different forums. I can give a couple examples later in this session of how we're seeing these questions answered and by who, and whether we're seeing more positive or more negative outcomes as it relates to environmental and climate justice. But I don't necessarily offer a prescribed way of answering these questions. I'm fortunate to get to work across 50 states in North America and with tribal communities. And I think that my own experience is just that there is a huge diversity of perspective on the answers to these questions, on the approaches to answering these questions, and that is really valuable. I would also say that we have a long way to go to imagine these systems to exist in a world where the arc is bent towards justice and not just repeating past harms or building these projects using these technologies in a way that replicates the unjust past that we have seen built and how that's impacted communities and people. So I'm going to stop there and just say thank you again to the organizers for having me. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the panel.
Thank you so much, Maya. That was great, setting the stage for us. Appreciate it. Dr. Batista, please.
Oh, thank you very much, Astrid. And thank you, Maya, for setting the stage. Make my job a little bit easier because, as you said, this is a very complex, technically complex terrain to navigate. And for most communities, it can be very, very confusing, especially all the acronyms, CCS, CDR. There's so many acronyms that people get totally lost, and even scholars and folks in the industry use some of these terms interchangeably. So it can be very overwhelming for folks. I'll just speak briefly about some of the areas of carbon management that myself and colleagues at the Tishman Center and with other colleagues, EJ scholars like Dr. Sheets and Dr. Yukian Lam and I have been doing in partnership with EJ communities around the issue of carbon management. And more specifically, I'm going to focus on carbon capture and sequestration, or sometimes they call it carbon capture utilization and sequestration, so CCS, CCUS, as well as hydrogen co-firing. Hydrogen fuels are another form of carbon management that is also being funded. And the particular environmental justice concerns that are being raised, actively contested right now in the US. And our center has been fielding phone calls and requests from communities across the country that are confronting many proposals for carbon capture and sequestration, CCUS, and hydrogen in the power sector and in industrial sectors in their communities. And so it's raised a lot of alarms. I will say that from my own perspective, much of the CCS industry and a lot of the carbon management industry is benefiting the same fossil fuel companies that got us into this climate crisis in the first place. So a majority of the billions of dollars that the federal government has set aside in tax credits have been going to companies like Occidental Petroleum to engage in this new frontier called carbon management. It's not so new. It's been around for a long time. But it's certainly raised, that in and of itself raises a lot of alarms, because in the environmental justice and climate justice movement, we know that we need a complete transition away from fossil fuels. And actually, that's what the IPCC is trying to tell us, not to adopt wide-scale CDR and CCS management tools. Not that they're absolutely inevitable. What they're modeling is different scenarios of the future. And what they're telling is if we want to avoid catastrophic climate change, we need a rapid and complete transition away from fossil fuels. Now, if you fund fossil fuel industries to entrench their infrastructures longer, which is what CCS does, we risk very much not ever transitioning from these fossil fuels or delaying that transition. And that's because carbon capture and sequestration, many of the fossil fuel companies are using that to keep their power plants, natural gas and coal plants online longer, to continue to do industrial processes that have harmful impacts on local communities of color and indigenous communities. And it completely entrenches those same patterns of environmental racism and environmental injustice. So that's one of the biggest concerns around some of these technologies. I'll mention that some of the work that we're doing currently with EJ communities is looking into the best available science and data and concerns around the risks that environmental justice communities overwhelmingly are being asked to bear in the rollout of CCS and hydrogen co-firing infrastructure in this country. And we've done some preliminary mapping that shows very clearly that the existing infrastructures sit disproportionately in environmental justice communities. And so any of the risks that come with capturing, storing, transporting this technologies falls on these communities that are already overburdened and underprotected. So some of the concerns specifically that are being raised in respect to CCS and hydrogen co-firing relate to the co-pollutants that come from the energy penalty to run this industrial infrastructure to capture carbon post-combustion at plants. There's good evidence that there in fact is quite a bit of an energy penalty and quite a few co-pollutants. And the co-pollutants are just your everyday air pollution that impacts people's health today, not just CO2 that impacts climate, but pollutants that harm people's health. And many of these communities are already overwhelmed with other detrimental pollution impacts. So this is contributing to cumulative burdens, these co-pollutants. There are also many risks and questions around the sequestration. How is sequestration happening? How's the transport of CO2 being done? And we already have many communities in the Gulf South who have faced this question, who have experienced the risks of exploding pipelines, and also have raised many, many questions about the viability of permanent sequestration and question that. Much of the sequestration of CO2 that's happening today is being used for enhanced oil recovery. So it's being used to push out more oil and gas rather than for climate mitigation purposes. There's also concerns about water scarcity, nitrogen oxide contamination related to hydrogen, coal firing. There are concerns about chemical spills and water contamination in aquifers. Seismic activity. There are communities in the Gulf South and in other parts in the Ohio River Valley that raise concerns about seismic activity when it comes to injection of carbon. These are just a few of the risks. And the most important thing that communities are raising at all these risks are being placed on communities that are already overburdened, already cumulatively impacted and susceptible, and have very little regulatory protections in place. Many of these communities don't have protections in the form of cumulative impacts policies. NEPA has been weakened, so many of these communities are not even sure what all the jurisdictional oversight will be to regulate these facilities. What kind of permits will they need? How will monitoring and long-term safety precautions be taken? And unfortunately, communities in many cases are being blackmailed into accepting projects, being told that it's inevitable, that they're going to get it anyway, so they better come up with community benefit plans. And in some cases, we've heard of communities being forced to sign NDA agreements. So there are many, many concerns about the governance around community engagement. The federal government is talking a lot about meaningful participation, but they have not said that communities have the right to say no. And if communities don't have a fundamental right to interject into decision-making processes and say no and push back and to raise the issues of risk and have those risks be dealt with, then they don't really have an opportunity for meaningful engagement. And that's part of the issue that many communities are facing right now, especially in states where much of the delegated authority will go to states. And in states that already have a poor track record of protecting their communities, allowing states to be in charge of the permitting and the oversight and the long-term monitoring for these issues brings in even another layer of risk for environmental justice communities that are vulnerable. So there are a whole host of ethical questions that come into play, and there's a rush to go right to how do we do meaningful engagement? How do we do community benefits for climate for EJ communities without first acknowledging and dealing with and getting a full accounting of the risks that communities are being asked to bear and trying to mitigate and protect those communities first from those harms before you're asking them to bear the risks. In other words, if carbon capture and sequestration and carbon and direct air capture hubs and hydrogen hubs were being placed in white, wealthy communities, that would be a different conversation, perhaps. Maybe those communities are not already overburdened and facing cumulative impacts. But that's not what's happening currently, unfortunately. And so we need to think about what are the ethical considerations of jumping into conversations about meaningful engagement without first having the conversation about the risks and who's benefiting and who's burdened by this push and rollout for federal funding and incentivizing of these infrastructures. So I'm going to stop there. I've said too much, but I'm happy to take questions later and share some resources in the comments section too that people can look at.
Thank you so much. Before we move on, can you just define energy penalty and NEPA? I have somebody asking that they don't really quite understand.
I apologize. Yes, I was going too fast. An energy penalty just means that if you have a power plant or an industrial plant that is being run on natural gas, for example, and then you add a carbon capture equipment, the amount of energy that it takes to run that carbon capture equipment to capture the CO2 at the stack or pre-combustion, the energy that it takes to do that is called the energy penalty. So it might require 25 to 30% more energy to power the system that captures the CO2. And what happens is if you need more energy, you also produce more air pollution, right? You don't just put out CO2 when you run a power plant, you put out NOx and SOx and particulate matter. There are other pollutants that come out when you need to produce energy. So that's energy penalty. And NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, which is a federal law that requires an environmental impact statements for major federal or federally funded projects. So like if you were going to construct a pipeline to carry CO2, the NEPA law may be triggered, but it may not. Currently, it's not clear whether NEPA would actually be triggered in the case of a pipeline siting. It may actually get an exemption and be considered a benefit to communities to have a pipeline through their community.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. We are now going to move on to Lenore. Lenore, please.
Well, Anna just saved me a ton of time because she just explained exactly what happens politically in Louisiana as it relates to oil and gas companies. So I'm the tribal administrator with the United Homa Nation in Southeast Louisiana to better understand what our community faces and has been for a number of years. Our communities in 1859 were actually moved into the southernmost bayous, bayou communities along Southeast Louisiana when we were burned out of our village. And so at that point in time, we were moved all the way to the coast. And so for the most part, our people lived there pretty easy. And we went from actually being and adapting from an agricultural based community to fisheries because, again, we're right on the waters. And in the 1930s, when oil and gas was discovered in Louisiana, our communities started experiencing some significant changes. And so one of the things that took place during those time periods were man-made canals and waterways made in order for the removal of oil and gas out of our communities. And so unfortunately, this is a time period in our lives where folks were not required to make it right. And so there were no mitigation factors in place. And one of the things is that has allowed saltwater intrusion to move in. And that's been a factor for our communities for many decades. And then we stack that on with the climate change issues and sea levels rising and those kinds of things. And we sit in this very precarious environment where we lose a football field of land where our tribal communities are the front line every hour. And so one of the things that's extraordinarily disheartening is there's no movement on the part by the state in any way, shape, or form to stop the bleeding, so to speak. And so, you know, just last month, we've got the notice that the Biden administration has issued a $1.4 billion allocation for carbon capture, sequestration, and carbon removal in Louisiana and Texas. And that sits right smack in the middle of an extraordinarily fragile environment. And so the community and where I'm physically sitting now, we're at like 10 feet sea level, 10 feet above sea level. And by way of, for a lot of our communities, that's really great. because the lower bayou community, some of them are below sea level. And then, so that's very problematic. So one of the things that when you look at this really vulnerable environment and you match this with the issue of the discussions and what we're hearing on the ground is the proposal of capturing carbon and using pipeline technology and injecting carbon into the lower layers. Well, you know, there's a reason in our community we bury people above ground. And that's because when you just go about a foot, you're hitting water. So our water table is very close. And so the challenge is that when we look at it and you look at the areas where there may have been issues of carbon retrieval, carbon sequestration, and things like that, this has not been done in a community like ours. And so the problem lies is they're more than likely in Louisiana, especially because all of the areas they're proposing are in the coastal areas, as this is going to be getting into the water system. And, you know, and I'm not a scientist by any means, they're a stretch of the imagination. But a little bit of research I can do tells me that when CO2 dissolves into water, it becomes carbonic acid, making the water more acidic. And so then what does that do to our communities? And what happens there? So one of the proposed sites that is in discussion right now actually goes from a community called Des Allemands, which is a very super small community in one parish, and travels over into the community I actually live in that is primarily African American community. But what's interesting is that will cross our drinking water supply. And so the problem lies, and I think Anna hit very heavily on the folks making money off of all of this, or the perpetrators of all the pollution that we've experienced. And the unfortunate part is who's doing the vetting and looking at the real impacts. And so questions and concerns about how is this going to affect fisheries, plants, and if there are impacts, the drinking water, and if there are impacts, how long does it take before someone actually takes action if they do? You know, because that's the unfortunate thing of what the community experience has been. And so it's a very scary prospect of what this can have and can do for our communities. And it begs the question of who's really looking out to help the communities. So I thank you.
Thanks, Lenora. Very well said. Nothing like being on the ground and seeing everything that's going on and feeling it on your own skin, right? Okay, we're going now to Nicole Parra, and it's our last speaker, and take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to my fellow panelists. I do have a PowerPoint presentation, but before I start, Nicole Parra, Vice President of Community Affairs. I'm right now in Kern County in Bakersfield, the place that I was born and raised. And, you know, just a couple points on, you know, for us here in California, when we're looking at some of these projects, and what I'll be highlighting is enhanced oil recovery was banned in California last year. And also where our direct air capture project and some of our carbon sequestration, in fact, a bunch of us were walking door to door yesterday. That's one of the things I pride myself on, is we're really just even with any information or any updates, you know, walking door to door in the communities surrounding Elk Hills, which was a former naval reserve. You know, that's where in Elk Hills, you know, the closest communities are about 4 or 5 miles away. And so we pride ourselves on, you know, education and outreach. But as I was asked today to kind of talk about specifically what we're doing in Kern County, specifically our partnership with community on our community benefit plans. It's unfortunate that in many areas that, it's sad to say, and hearing from Anna about forced, non-disclosure agreements or community benefit plans, that just breaks my heart. And I say that because as someone who's represented and been involved with community, one of the things when I was working on the community benefits plan for the direct air capture hub, we prided ourselves on the community, coming together, the community forming the advisory panel. And I'm going to hit present here. So let's see slides. I think I just do slides. So Google Slides. Oh, I don't know. What am I supposed to? I thought I just hit present. Let's see. Share screen. Is it share screen? Are my slides? I thought they were on. No.
Did you press present?
Yeah, I have present. I thought they were already loaded up. Okay, present. And then what do I hit? It says slides, right? Hit slides. It says I have no slides. Okay, let's see if I can. No. Okay. So I hit present. Do you know where my slides are, anyone?
We're messaging the
Okay.
organizer.
All right. Let me see if
You
I
could
can
talk on it briefly. Mhm.
Well,
Talk
so
briefly.
yeah, the slide's gonna tell the story. Let me see here. Would I be able to share if I go to my computer?
Yeah, let me try that.
This is great. Your computer. Profile. Are they saying anything?
No, you may have to walk us through it a little
Hi,
bit.
can you hear me? Hi, this is IT. How are you?
Okay. Good.
Okay, great. Sorry for the problem. You're saying you're having trouble presenting your presentation, correct?
Yes.
Do you have your presentation with you currently?
I sent the presentation
Okay,
and
you sent it.
I hit present.
Okay, you sent it. Okay, so we need to. Okay, give me 1 second. I got you. Let me find your presentation for you.
Okay.
While we wait, if anybody has any extra points that they would like to make, please feel free.
Well, let me just, so until they find, so one of the things that we did with the community benefits plan is that I was working as the head of our California Energy Renewable Lab at the Kern Community College District. And I was asked to work with the community groups to work with California Resources Corporation and APRI electrical power folks when they were applying for the direct air capture hub for California. So one of the first things we did was to go out into the rural communities, that is in Arvin, Lamont, and in Taft, to talk to community about what direct air capture is. And you're absolutely right. When we're talking about all of these acronyms or what we're working on in the energy space, we have to definitely not only talk about the acronyms, but produce materials in different languages to be able to have, be able to go door to door, to go to community events. And so we spent about a year meeting with community, talking to community. And so we put together this consortium. Is called the CalDAC Hub Consortium. And in the PowerPoint, you'd be able to see folks from the Mexican American Opportunity Foundation and so forth. And then we were also reaching out to our environmental justice partners that we had worked with for a number of years, such as the Dolores Huerta Foundation and Center for Race and Poverty. In fact, we had the Department of Energy out in California who came out to look and talk about some of the projects that they're doing regarding some of the LEAP projects, local energy programs, and so forth. And so at that Department of Energy hearing and presentation we had in Arvin, Lamont, we had some of the environmental justice members present, which I always keep with me. It's the carbon use and storage, their platform. And what I wanted to show in my PowerPoint was that we, in the community benefits plan, we outline transparency. We're working with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. We have 2 national labs working with us on the Justice 40, on updating on water quality, on updating on air and co-pollutants and so forth. We also are working with our labor brothers and sisters on apprenticeship and cohorts and partnership programs. And in the community, really bringing in people in forming an advisory committee that will be paid people who will be part of our decision-making process. We will have childcare, we will have transportation, and part of that advisory committee, when we're talking about every step of the direct air capture from the construction operation, will be a part of that. Oh, here we are. Thank you so much. And so let's see here, and then I can just hit enter to move slides. Okay. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to kind of skip through this. So California Resources Corporation, we're in California. We're in the Sacramento Basin, the San Joaquin Basin, and the Los Angeles Basin. And so Kern County, what I'm talking about is where the direct air capture hub, which we were awarded about a month ago. Okay. Gosh. Okay. I'm going to skip this slide. It's kind of, there we go. I'm going to skip these. I'm going to get straight to, there we go. So Kern County at a glance, just so you get a big picture, is we are the #1 ag producing county, San Joaquin Valley, in the country. And then when you look at the energy capital of California, to give you some perspective, we provide in Kern County 70% of the oil and 60% of the renewable energy in the state. If it wasn't for our county planner, Lorelei Oviatt, who 20 years ago started siting wind turbines and solar panels, our grid, our California grid, would not be as stable as it is now. When you look at the 3 largest counties in California, with Kern County being #2, providing those resources to the grid to keep our electricity on in California. So Kern County, again, while providing our transportation fuels and many things, we're also providing 60% of the renewable energy in the state. Do I just hit enter here? Okay, so significant federal and state investment in Kern County. I wanted this slide to really show the perspective of state and federal investments in our county. Again, based in agriculture and oil for decades. We worked really hard to design our High Road Training Partnership grants, our SURF grants, which are a Community Economics Resilient Fund with our labor brothers and sisters, our Community LEAP grants from the Department of Energy. We got money from the state budget, $50 million. That's what I was executive director of. To create a California Renewable Energy Lab. And with that lab and the $2 million partnership with California Resources Corporation, we were able to stand up 3 energy institutes. And we have our clean transportation, our carbon sequestration, and carbon capture and sequestration, and then partnerships with CSUB. And then we mentioned here Carbon TerraVault. Next slide. Thank you, you're doing it. The DAC Hub Consortium, you can see in the San Joaquin Basin, it would spread out throughout California. And skip next slide. Sorry, I want to go through these because I understand time. Our DAC, Direct Air Capture Hub, is really, we have different clusters. Next slide, please. This is what I wanted to show you, was that the consortium from our national laboratories to our academia, to our workforce partners, to even Grandma Whoople, our wonderful teacher who has joined us, Mexican American Opportunity, the African American Network of Kern County, and the Open Door Network, who works with homeless individuals who have partnerships with the city and county, who are want to be a part of our apprenticeship programs, to Hone Indian Tribe, the Black Chamber of Kern County, Community Action Partnership of Kern. All of these folks have a seat at the table from the beginning. And that's really one of the things that the community benefit plans, which in 3 months we will turn into actual agreements. Agreements about, next slide, please. That was the cover of the community benefits plan I submitted to the Department of Energy. These are real people, not stock photos. Next slide, please. And CalHub Consortium members, the picture on the left is the press conference we held when we received word we had the T2 DAC grant. And in the picture on the side is actually the future home of our demonstration for the direct air capture. It's in Elk Hills, about 4 miles from community. That's Assistant Secretary Crabtree, his team, some state agency folks. And that was before we met with community. Next slide, please. These are the 4 sections of the community benefits plan. Next slide, please. And phases for 2 years. For community labor, I have it separated into 4 phases: project awareness, community feedback, negotiate labor agreements, execute, invest in America's workforce. We're doing a JEDI analysis on economic development, our DEIA, ensuring that we're hitting with our supply, with our vendors, our subcontractors. You go to Taft right now. I was walking Main Street in McKittrick. You'll see boarded up buildings, boarded up houses, boarded up main streets because of the property taxes, sales taxes from a lot of the former businesses that were there. And we're really trying to get more resources with this DOE grant. I have $2.5 million for the community benefits plan. That's real money for people in communities where there's 49 people living in Fellows, 50 people living in McKittrick. This is game changing for a lot of these communities. Justice 40, we're developing a Justice 40 database and dashboard. By phase 4, I want to create with the city and the county and the community a Justice 40 community center. Next slide, please. We are always looking at the lens through, two-way engagement. And we're looking at, for us, the sequestering of carbon would be 8,000 feet below, not impacting the water tables. But again, we work very closely. We're applying. We have an application for a Class 6 permit. And if any of you, I know many on this panel have read the go, no go, how much work goes into, these permits, and working with, our Region 9, Martha Guzman and her team, to ensure that community is involved and updated, and we have all of this in a transparent way. Next slide, please. Go ahead and skip this slide. Justice 40. These are the things. We're going to have a dashboard in real time, updating community, different languages, different places, door to door. People, and I'm trying to get something even, we're going to do community block parties. We're going to be in the community, interview with community on direct, indirect, renewable energy demand. Oh, and our partner Climeworks for the direct air capture. The power sources are going to be renewable in our current front. That's solar heating up the DAC. And so Climeworks would not work and was very stringent on ensuring that the power source was renewable. Community air quality monitoring. Next slide. I think I have a couple more. And just some of the quotes from some of our leaders. Okay, go ahead and end the slide deck. Okay, so we're really, I'm really proud of the work we've done, but this is just, one area. We're doing some geothermal work. We're doing some long duration energy storage, because in California, we need an all the above energy policy. We cannot afford, and we have to be able to support our communities, bring in our communities. But everything that you all are talking about in your communities, we all need to work together to help each other in every region. And so I am, like I said, I'm proud of the work we've done in Kern County and the state and the partnerships we've made, because I live here, my family lives here, and I have a record of community. And I'm taking this company, our CEO, Francisco Leon, and Nelly Molina, our CFO, Mexican Americans, who said, Nicole Parra, you go, you tell us what we need to do. We're a company, we have your back, and we're going to do and be the leader in this energy transition and bring everyone with us. So boom, sorry about that, folks, that my PowerPoint was late. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Appreciate it. There's so many issues, but I think you did very well with your time, considering all the technological challenges. So that was excellent. So at the moment, we have no questions from the audience. So I'm gonna keep going, and I'm gonna ask a few questions. For Maya, starting with you. You mentioned the several technologies that are being developed, and to deal with the issues that come along with this emissions and everything. But what are ways that these technologies could be implemented with regards to climate justice? Are there any best practices? Are there any examples of ways to implement technologies that you think would be, the companies should really look for?
Well, I think one of the hardest parts about this suite of technologies and approaches is that it's very much in theoretical stage right now, and we are only just starting to see opportunities to really imagine what these technologies will look like on the ground once they're built. The example that I would point to as one that's really interesting to me is led by a coalition of folks called the Community Alliance for Direct Air Capture. Among other folks who are part of that alliance, Carbon 180 is leading it. California Berkeley Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment is part of it, other organizations. And the way that they're approaching this through the DOE funding for a direct air capture hub is to start with community, and this is in the San Joaquin Valley, to start with community engagement and to have that really be the focus of the work rather than the reverse, which is decide that you're going to build a project, go in and tell the community about it. They're really starting from the community's perspective to better understand whether this is something that works for them. And if the answer is no, then that's where the project will end. And I think that that's an interesting approach to thinking about how these technologies could be implemented in a way that centers equity and justice first, as opposed to trying to apply a lens of equity and justice after the decision around building a project has been made. So that's one that I would point to as an example.
Thank you. That was very good. I'm going to follow up with a question for Anna. You mentioned that there are risks of leaving state governments in charge of regulatory oversight for the hubs, the AC hubs. Some of these governments have the history of environmental injustices in Black, brown, and low-income communities. Do you believe the federal government is more equipped to mitigate them?
It's a good question. Unfortunately, neither the federal government nor state governments are well equipped to handle many of these things, because many of the governance questions and permitting questions around these risks have not been fully fleshed out. And when we ask the Department of Energy, who has jurisdiction, what will be the requirements for new source review, if any, for carbon capture or sequestration on existing plants, they were unsure. They're like, we're not sure. It's going to be a case-by-case basis. The EPA will be in conversation with state governments, depending on the size of the plant, the size of the CCS, the type of the CCS. So there are many unanswered questions around governance and regulatory oversight. That being said, the folks down in Louisiana, in cases that are the class 6 wells, the primacy fights around the country bring into clear relief the fact that there is very little confidence in the record of certain state governments to oversee very important long-term monitoring and enforcement of environmental laws and protections for communities in places like Louisiana. And so there are a lot of questions about whether state governments can do that work at all. And certainly a lot of communities are pushing back and asking the federal government for greater clarity. And there is an opportunity for the federal government to do a lot more work on its part to clarify the jurisdictional questions and the regulatory and risk questions, long-term risk and monitoring questions that are not yet answered at the same time that projects are actively being funded. Tax credits are being given as direct pay credits to companies without requirements around long-term monitoring and liability questions still unanswered. So in 50 years, you're talking about permanent sequestration. In 50 years, who holds liability if there's a seismic event or a leak or an explosion? Who's actually monitoring? In places like Norway, where they have tremendous investments in government structures, they've seen abject failure in long-term monitoring of a lot of their sequestration projects. And this is a country that's invested a lot of money in their governance. So their conclusion from that very big investment that their federal government's made is, we're not ready yet. We're not ready for sequestration yet. It may be a thing we need, but we need a lot more work on the governance side to get this right. And unfortunately, in this country, EJ communities are being asked to take the risks up front and to really bet their lives that we'll figure this out later.
Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting, because another thing that we hear is that if the states get primacy, then they may have a much faster process without all the due diligence in some situations. And we know that's happening right now on the offshore wind off the coast of Louisiana, which is the same kind of thing. They're not doing the due diligence, and the state is trying to get the primacy. So there is also that issue of the state wanting to do it because their process is not as complex as EPA federal, right? Is that correct?
That's right. I mean, they want to streamline the process. And they've said they've been very, very, I think Louisiana is a great case study. Texas, a lot of states are like very upfront about their wanting to take primacy to speed up the process, streamline it, and not necessarily to add additional protections for communities. And they've admitted if you read the Louisiana Attorney General's letter to the EPA, he basically admits that we don't have a good track record of enforcing our own environmental laws. So it's really egregious in terms of what states are trying to do to really steamroll this. And unfortunately, I'll have to say that Justice 40, which is supposed to bring benefits to EJ communities, is being used as a tool by the Department of Energy to say, this is a, carbon capture in a pipeline. That's a benefit to your community, irrespective of whether you want it or not. We're going to consider it a Justice 40 benefit in our calculations in our dash cam. And that's how DOE is going to be treating all manner of carbon management projects, from hydrogen co-firing, DAC, CCS, CCUS. That is a huge opportunity cost, because those are dollars and targeted funding that could have gone into renewable energy transitions that communities may not see.
Thank you so much. I'm going to kind of flip the question here. We had a question that is, what resources are available to help communities so that they can understand the issue better, and what actions can they take once they understand it? I'm going to flip the question and ask Lenore, what resources would you like to see available? What would you like to see change in these processes so that the community is well informed and know what actions can be taken? Like, for instance, what stage of NEPA can the community intercede or have a voice, right? So yeah, that's my question, Lenore.
So one of the things that's really tragic in the way a lot of this is handled is the public notification process of these kinds of projects is very limiting. So notice in the newspaper goes out that there's this public meeting, and if folks are just not dialed into that type of thing, it'll go completely unnoticed, which folks tend to I think appreciate to a certain extent. And so one of the things I think would be extraordinarily helpful would be the opportunity to have more training for science, even within our school systems, on the science of all of the things that are in our community that our kids can be exposed to, because they're going to be the generation inheriting all of this, so that they can be informed to be able to then better understand moving into all of this. I think it would be really, really important. But the other thing is holding the feet to the fire to the state agencies that there's true engagement, and that it's not just rubber stamps, of what goes on, and where there is an opportunity for real discourse with not just a general meeting out there, but the very people that are going to be directly impacted by particular projects. And so that there is a meaningful way of notifying and engaging those individuals, and being able to have some level of training so that people can give thoughtful feedback. It's basically, hey, here's the project and come and give your feedback. You've got 5 minutes and that's it. And so I think that's one of the things is it's really not true community engagement.
Thank you so much, Lenore. And I think that leads me to a question that I had for Nicole. Nicole, can you talk a little more about the community agreements, which in some ways is kind of connected with what Lenore has been talking about, what are the real benefits, how the community, gets engaged, et cetera.
Yeah, and so for our, I know what Project Maya was talking about, the group for their T1, they received the DAC award to move on at that kind of T1 level. We applied and received the DOE funding for topic area 2, which means we're ready to do the front end engineering study, which we need to demonstrate to the Department of Energy that we have accomplished what we said in our community benefits plan, which is over 24 months, 2.5 million, in addition to being able to show that the technology works and that we were able to sequester 50,000 tons of carbon. So for us, it was important to be able to have, which we're fortunate to have, the reservoir in Elk Hills. So when we're going to community and talking to them about the project, it wasn't we're doing this, now join us, not at all. It was we have the ability to capture the carbon. We are applying for a feasibility study. And a year ago, we started. Will you join us in this partnership? And many of them said, well, tell us about the partnership. So we even had to, with community, what would be the best way to communicate? Which methods? And it all goes back to how much time and effort. I mean, going door to door when you tell people, it's I've got about 20 precinct boxes in my office right here, is what you need to do every day, every community meeting, pop-ups and so forth. So I just wanted to just mention that. But the community benefit agreements, the Department of Energy and T2 did not require community benefit agreements. And it's so funny that the carbon management initiative that FECM has put out, Federal Energy Carbon Management Division, we already submitted our comments to the Federal Register because I think that T2, DAC, or any type of carbon removal or management, we need to have some community benefit agreements outlined in our plan. So I even mentioned that as something that they should do in the future. But I preface that by saying the community benefits committee that we will be forming with people from the community, labor, I will invite environmental justice to have seats and to be able, I didn't want to dictate what the agreement should look like. It will come from this committee within 3 months. And many in the community, many of us who've worked in the community, you know, many of the things is whether it's to ensure that there's some air monitors in the communities, that there's real-time monitoring. One of the things that has happened, we had a lot of flooding that hit our rural communities. And because we don't have the infrastructure and levees to protect our rural communities, and then when incident command is set up during emergencies, as many of you know, that it's incident command will call someone and say, okay, communities evacuate. Okay, communities do this. And we're like, no one speaks the language. No one knows the communities. I was in Allensworth when they said Allensworth was evacuated. And I'm looking around the town and everyone's there. And so everyone in California reads in the LA Times, oh, Allapaw and Allensworth, the community's gone. No, they weren't. No, they weren't. So we're putting in our direct air capture community benefits, we're going to bring them in the incident command. We're going to train people. We're going to bring them in to be the community voice in the command center next to the fire chief, next to the, whoever's making decisions, they will be in there. They will be training people in the communities. We're changing that. That has never been done before. And then the second thing is we're also going to do some technical assistance. I mentioned this to DOE in my notes to the Federal Register, is that we need to ensure that we give the full picture to community. What is a letter of intent? What is a grant? What does it mean, scope of, all of these things. I want to do classes with community colleges and the high schools and the gym, and really working through, I used to do this, how to vote by mail, how to vote for ballots, how to vote. We need to do this in all of these federal government grants and initiatives. We are doing that. I have money to do it. And that's the game changer for community, and let them decide if they want to support these projects or not. But at least they'll have the tools and the foundation that no one's funding at any level, but we will in our plan.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is great. This is the way, right? This is great. So I have one question for all the panelists. We have just a couple minutes per panelist to answer this one. And it's about, it's two questions. What are opinions on using direct air capture to reduce legacy emissions since the Industrial Revolutions? These emissions will not abate without direct removal. So can this carbon dioxide removal technologies be used as a justice tool, for instance? And I'm going to go in order of presentation. Maya starts.
I wish I knew the answer to that in a discrete way. I'm certainly interested in having that conversation, and that's why I'm here on the panel. The reality is there is too much CO2 in the atmosphere. Here in California, I have been part of many wildfire seasons, extreme heat seasons. It is getting worse by the year. There have been times when I have been working at my computer looking at this dystopian scene of ash falling from the sky outside of my window and asking myself, how are we going to take on this challenge? I don't know what it will look like for every individual community with respect to a direct air capture facility. I want to be part of the conversation around advancing a more equitable approach to it, that's for sure, because these projects are going to come down. And I think it's really important that we create systems and have the dialogue around how we do that in a way that does not repeat past injustices. The only other thing I'd say is we've talked a lot about technology today, but I don't want to forget about the power of nature and the opportunities that we have to use natural systems to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through land management approaches, in particular looking towards Indigenous communities who have been stewarding land since time immemorial. And so I just want to say that I think there are a lot of approaches for us to think about carbon management, removal in particular, that are outside of the sphere of technological approaches. And while we didn't talk about that today, I think it's an important part of this broader conversation.
Thank you. Anna?
Well, I think technically speaking, industrial direct air capture cannot remove, or is not designed currently to remove, other air pollutants directly from the atmosphere, many of which act very differently than CO2 in the atmosphere, because currently the technology uses a tremendous amount of energy. When I'm glad to hear in California they're using renewable energy, but in many places, in many instances, uses fossil energy, a tremendous amount of fossil energy to directly capture CO2 from a diffuse atmospheric environment and chemically mix it with other chemicals and amines to create a liquid form of CO2 that then can be more easily transported and injected. So that process is not set up to capture other air pollutants in the atmosphere, and actually creates more air pollution in the process of capturing the CO2 and empowering the technology to capture that CO2. So unfortunately, it is not a solution that's going to address legacy air pollution, and it's probably going to further exacerbate that situation further for communities that host it. But I will say, in Maya, it's not all doom and gloom. I am with Maya here. There are amazing things that nature does without a huge amount of human intervention, in terms of soil reforestation, in terms of mangrove restoration, that have multiple benefits for the public health, for the restoration of our ecosystems. But those also have ethical questions that come into play too, about who gets to make the decisions about those investments and who benefits from those. But there are natural systems at play that can store carbon, but legacy pollution requires us to look at not further exacerbating that problem in the hopes of mitigating the climate. We harm people along the way even further.
Thank you. Lenore, have a couple minutes to go.
Yeah, I agree. I think the natural approaches, particularly for us, I mean, we have multiple issues at play, and the natural issues of planting more trees, particularly cypress trees, thrive really, really well with carbon, high intake of carbon, and they're an endangered tree in our community, but they are also highly sought after for coastal bank restoration. It has deep, nice root systems and that kind of stuff for our swamplands and that kind of stuff. And so it does have the potential for us to actually serve the taking care of two issues at once.
Thank you. Nicole.
Yeah, and I'll just be quick. Look, to meet our California climate targets by 2045, carbon neutrality, we need to do everything that was mentioned here. And so for us, direct air capture is just one tool. We're doing studies in Elk Hills and partnering with the California Energy Commission and the DOE, hopefully DOE, to be able to look at geothermal, to be able to look at 24-hour long duration energy storage. We don't want to have to keep this grid, our, Cal ISO to be, continuing to band-aid the solution to find energy sources to keep our lights on. And the ban on internal combustion engines in 2035 in California, to ensure that we have rebates to people in our rural communities who are not buying Teslas, who need a used car, but they want to be clean, whatever source it is, to give them the benefits and not just certain zip codes in the state of California. We really need to look at the greenhouse gas funds of where the regulated entities are spending or sending the money, and how those monies are allocated into what programs to give more bang for the buck. So for me, I'm looking at it as, can we do better now? Yes, we can. We can help decarbonize our industrial, whether it's cement and steel and our refineries, yes, we can do that as long as we can do it in a way that is transparent and brings in community and our frontline communities. And we're looking at different feed studies. We can do it, but we need, to look at land and natural-based regenerative farming. I wish we had some bigger system in the Central Valley. We're ag producers. Let's do more. And water. And there's so many things that we can do now instead of just trying to, if we ended fossil fuels tomorrow or the next year, our economy, there's so many different things than transportation fuels. And especially like in California rural communities, how would our economies exist if we banned it today? And so we need to be pragmatic about getting to that transition, getting there and doing it in a way that we're not relying on nuclear natural gas plants that our governor's just extended to keep our power going. So there we go.
Yeah, we're out of time. So I would like to thank all the panelists. This was a great discussion. Thank you all for agreeing to be here. I would like to thank our audience and, of course, the University of Maryland and Environmental Justice Symposium organizers. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. This was a great conversation. Bye.